Everyone, please turn on their lights.
No.
Yes, I'll get it to you. Okay.
Where's the sweater? I never know what it's gonna be.
That's why we're long. Play it safe. So when are you leaving?
There's room over here.
Well, I thought you and I could go
Daddy's not
Monday,
coming.
but you have the thing.
So, Jay-
Monday,
Daddy's not
yeah.
coming.
So,
Sunday, I think Sunday morning.
oh, wow. So,
Yeah.
At a conference.
so Carrie and
She
Patty
might have
are
had it
leaving
on
next Monday.
I
for
can
the
get it so
flight
from
out. So we'll be there that night.
We could do it out. Okay. I'll hold down.
So on that Monday, I'll go to the meetings.
But aren't we all going together?
Yes, yeah,
I believe she's, and I write you.
I think, yeah.
It's 1 o'clock. And is this clock right now or
Right.
slow or?
New clock,
Wow.
and it should be right on, right?
Okay.
Oh, my gosh, it's hard to figure out what time it is.
Call to order for the Joint Board of Directors and Budget and Finance Committee Special Meeting for April 9th, 2024. Roll call, please.
President Hamilton,
Here.
Vice President Johnson,
Here.
Director Mack,
Here.
Director Dale.
Here.
And Director Townsend Smith is absent. We have members Hensley,
Here.
Member Nelson,
Here.
Member Stewart.
Here.
Thank you.
Please follow me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Are there any additions, deletions, or amendments to the agenda?
No additions to the agenda.
Do I have an approval, a motion for approval of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Director Mack, seconded by Director Johnson. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Public comment. That you, Teresa, or me? Any person may address the board at this time upon any subject not identified in on this agenda, but within the jurisdiction of the Rainbow Municipal Water District. Do we have any requests at this time?
We have none at this time. However, if anyone joining us online would like to provide public comment at any point throughout the duration of this meeting, please use the webinar controls to raise your hand and you'll have 3 minutes to speak once called upon. If you're joining us by telephone, please dial *9 to alert us that you'd like to speak, *6 to unmute yourself, and please keep your comments to 3 minutes. I'm seeing none. Thank you.
And I mean, you said we had nobody online, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. Budget workshop #1 presentation.
I'll kick us off here and again, appreciate the joint meeting, getting the finance committee members as well as the board together. Yeah, really appreciate the time. Felt like our workshop #1 was really productive, talking through the CIP program. I know we spent about 3 hours, but really appreciated it. I mean, just the engagement by everybody. And so we're looking for, maybe it doesn't have to go 3 hours, but we're looking for, a similar thing today as we work through the budget. And I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's an exciting time for the district. We do have some opportunities. We have, some clarity on detachment and, and there are some expenses related to that, expenses that, we're both in our CIP program and related to us detaching that we're going to have to deal with. So we're going to talk through a lot of those things today, some of the, I'd say the short-term challenges, but really the overall picture. I think that's where the exciting part gets, right? When you start to look at the savings and kind of how that coming to fruition and that long-term picture hasn't changed. That is You're going to see that today. But there are some challenges, and that's I appreciate. I wanted to say thank you to Rick and his staff, and really all staff. Chad's work on the CIP, and really, everybody across the district kind of pitching in on putting budgets together and really giving a clear picture of the needs of the district. It's a big effort, but I know Rick has carried and his staff have really carried a heavy load on what you're going to see today, and really, just in general, tried to, as a team here, try to strike a balance. And this is what we've been telling our ratepayers as well, is that, the detachment was going to take a little bit of time, and it's still, we've got a little bit left to go. I think we see the light at the end of the tunnel here pretty quick, but really there is a balance there between, we're going to talk about, healthy reserve levels. And what does that look like for the district? We have a CIP that's probably a little overdue. We probably need to accelerate some funding on the CIP, and we saw that the last workshop. And then obviously the big promise, which was, hey, we want to reduce pressure on future rate increases, and you're going to see that too. That in the, again, we have these short-term pressures, but as you move forward, even as early as last year, we were talking about 9% rate increases over 5 years just to kind of stay, keep pace with what was being thrown at us. And you're going to see that's really come down a ton, right? So we're, slice of that pie that we're using for things that would have had to go on to rates, right? The CIP program, inflation, the things that we're trying to budget for, we're trying to budget conservatively. You're going to see a piece of that pie. So what we're bringing forth today, we're trying to strike a nice balance between those things. But obviously this is your first look at it, other than you got the presentation yesterday. Excited to have your eyes on it too. I think even just like our CIP workshop, last month, it just helps you get a different set of eyes, a different perspective, and that's what we're all here for, right? It's a team effort to kind of see this district move forward in a really positive way. But I think there is a lot of opportunity, challenges, but opportunity, both in long-term savings and eventually you're going to see the details, but we've got some debt that's going to fall off that provides additional opportunities. And so we're trying to look at all those things. And again, Rick did the very, very, very heavy lifting on this. And you'll see all that detail here as he goes through it. But that's kind of the overall picture, what we were trying to bring forward to this group. So Rick, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Jake was talking about, this presentation is probably the most critical one of the series, at least from my perspective, because this is where we tackle the overarching, where are we, where do we need to go, where do we want to go, and next month and the month after get more into just the details. What does that look like on the operating budget? We have those times also set aside if there's any follow-up from this meeting to be able to bring that back, so that you're not having to make decisions in June. We can look at these things over the next couple of months. So today is a bit ambitious to tackle quite a few big topics, but we're trying to present them all together because it's all a comprehensive package. So you need to see the whole thing together. And so starting out with really, where are we and where are we going if we don't do anything? And that's where you'll see a projection and the results of if we don't do anything. And then what we propose to actually do. You'll see a pretty big challenge right up front. And so how do we tackle that challenge short term? And then what does that look like long term to achieve all the things that we've been talking about achieving? All of these deal with subjects like how much debt do we have, what our reserve should be, and then ultimately, once we do all these things, then what does the picture look like? And so that's where it concludes. So, and again, next month we'll be looking at the actual detailed budget and some of the more detailed rates, and then getting into adoption in June. So where are we heading? So this starts with staff trying to make sure that we knew what was ahead of us. And so Although with the rate study and other things that we did last year, there were projections. We needed to get a lot more granular. And so this became a month by month projection over the next 5 years. Obviously, any future projections are going to just be wrong, but this does start taking into consideration a lot of exactly how the district operates. You know, when do we make our insurance payments? When do we pay PERS? When do we pay debt service? All these sorts of things. And so this projection gets mapped out for you and the results of that in this graphic on the slide. So what this is showing is for our combined finances, water and wastewater, what happens to our cash levels should detachment occur. And this assumes essentially the savings start kicking in January. So a little conservative, you know, we're hoping for sooner than that, but don't want to count on it. And then, so detachment happens, but we don't raise rates and we don't take out any debt. So what would just naturally sort of happen? I'll get into the results of that soon. But the look at it, just to orient everyone on the graph, so we're all looking at it the same way. The most important part of it is the green shading, because that tells you what our cash balance is at that point in time, looking into the next 5 years. So now you see it's over the 10 million mark. That's as of the end of March. And then over the next 5 years, where does that go? Your eye will get drawn to November of 2024 when that green disappears. And then it starts going in the negative, all things considered. And so that's really what the slide is getting to, is that should we do nothing else, our cash reserves would be drawn down to zero. And with the projection, this is give or take a couple months. So this could happen as early as late summer or after that. But this is the present problem that we're trying and we'll need to tackle. And so the question comes up, well, how do we get here? I don't know that I'm certified enough to look at the past, but I can say where we are is about 12 million in cash currently. And we have some large cash outflows in this period and even a little bit beyond that. 2 critically necessary CIP projects, which are active and large for the district, the Thoroughbred lift station on the wastewater side, and obviously the 3 pump stations to enable detachment on the water side. Both of those are active and we're paying on them right now. And then you throw in things like there's large debt service payments in the middle of all of this. We have the $3.2 million exit fee payments. There's just large payments that come in. So that green disappears, I think, more quickly than it normally would if we were just paying sort of operating bills all in. And so the point of it all is to say we have a cash flow issue. There is a solution and we'll get into that. But even with detachment, this is the other major part of this slide.
And the savings that will be there.
It'll take a little bit of time.
Sorry about that.
Ghost in the system. Is the savings don't bring us out of that hole. It's not enough. Unless you completely eliminate any kind of CIP or anything other than just paying operating bills, which of course we know isn't sustainable. So the next part, which is the fun part, which is what do we do about this? And the next slides, I won't get into too much, but it's if you wanted to look at the lens of just water and just wastewater, slightly different pictures. The one I'll probably draw most attention to is here I mentioned the pump station and the debt service payments. So you see how significant that is in the next months and what that does to cash. Water reserves, so to speak, deplete much more quickly just because of the size of the project and the debt service and the exit fee payment on top of that. On the wastewater side, we start with a little bit more healthy cash position. That's mostly because we just took out a $5 million loan for this one to pay for this project. And so that comes down a little bit less quickly, so to speak. And so you get depletion of reserves by mid next year. But after that, it's in the negative at the same point. And of course, wastewater doesn't benefit at all from the savings from detachment. So it stands on its own. Where you get towards the end of the 5 years, and this is just to explain that, because we had in the CIP that $9 million or so project relating to the lift station that's tied to a development project. Since it's in the CIP spend, we also show the capacity piece coming in to pay for it. So that's the orange bar that goes in the negative. That's actually revenue coming in on capacity fees. It builds up cash for a little bit and then we spend it down on the project. But overall, because we have other projects, large projects going on, that's where you see the large negative cash balance. So that just gets into the water and wastewater stories a little bit more independently. We do try to be conservative, so just so you know what's going into this. Obviously, we're projecting about 10,000 acre feet in sales this year. It's a big question mark what that'll be in the future. The last 2 years have been affected by wet weather, but as we've all seen, rates themselves and the increases in just the economy impacts future sales. And so I think at least staying around the 10,000 acre feet until we know otherwise is conservative, and it's the best thing to count on for the time being. But there are some additional large changes that go into the projection going forward, and these are all reflected. There are expenses relating to our change in operations with detachment. And so I'll be the first one to say this is educated guesswork at this point. We'll know once we actually change operations and see what it is. The first being is as we move water differently, we have to treat differently, specifically relating to what we're putting into Morrow. And so there's a pretty substantial increase in chemical costs for that. This projection has about an extra 800,000 going towards that. Obviously, there's three, and we can get in. If you have a question at any point, we can stop and get into it. There obviously are 3 new pump stations. The question will be how much water and when we're moving that water through the pump stations. And so based on sort of current costs with existing pump stations, estimated about another 500,000 in electrical costs for pump stations. And we'll have a new lift station too. And so about an extra 40,000 electrical costs for the Thoroughbred lift station.
Rick, quick question. On the chemical treatment, we're going to have to be treating the water we're using today differently tomorrow?
Yes. So
Not necessarily, but you're moving a lot more water through Morrow, right? Instead
Right.
of bringing it directly from.
So you'll be using more chemicals. Okay. All right. Thank you.
the whole,
Theory, yes.
yeah, the whole chemistry changes because we're pulling it from different parts. And so,
Well, it's not really the chemistry, it's your volume flow.
Yes.
Okay.
and so, so we have an increase in chemical costs there. We aren't relying on capacity fees in this projection. As we've all seen, we hear lots and lots about certain developments coming in and then years, decades, who knows? So it's not until it's in. With a couple of exceptions, the Bonsall Oaks, we're actually looking at within a couple of months getting that in. There's CFD, so to speak, being put in right now. The numbers look reasonable and real at this point. And so there's a small amount built into the projection for that. And then the one project that wouldn't happen unless the development happened, obviously we have the capacity fees in there, so the equation balances out. Basic inflationary assumptions. And so, yes, Flint.
If I go to the page before that, where you were doing the 5-year cash flow, and I'm looking at wastewater, I'm not completely understanding the label for the orange total non-operating expenses. Okay, I get that. And then parentheses revenue. That would mean that the down facing gold bar in June of 27 represents the influx of capacity fees. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and that influx appears to be on the order of $10 million.
Yes, so this would be the large Ocean Breeze development. And so we included it in this case because you see the orange bars following it are elevated. Those are CIP projects that we would have to do if the development goes in.
Right.
So,
And we'd be using the 10 mil to pay
To
for
pay them.
that over time, right?
yes.
Question. Ocean Breeze, are we depending on that? That's been going for quite some time.
So no, we're not depending on it. It's simply we have the project associated with that in the CIP. And so if
Okay,
it doesn't happen, then the CIP expense goes away. So
okay,
they just
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
evens itself out.
Yeah, it's washed. Thank you. That's what my question was. Thanks.
And you've included because there's
Mm.
a strong probability that it will go through.
Well, the
Just
project's
when?
in there, so we're trying to protect.
Mhm, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question on that too. So beyond the capacity fees, what other obligations does the developer have to pay for the additional lift station that's needed to serve the development?
That's a good question. I mean, the lift station itself won't only serve, I mean, there is lift stations on that site that they'll be responsible to build, right? The ones that
Yeah.
are specifically related to that development. But this, which I think they call the schoolhouse
Mhm.
lift station, is actually, now it's driven by, hey, when we get a big increase, which they would drive, this needs to be built, but it doesn't just serve them. So the
Mhm.
responsibility would be to fund a significant portion of it. But it's not just it's just not related to them.
So is that developer going to pay like 30% or whatever their portion of that station is that they're going to be
I think right now the capacity,
attributing flows to?
well, and that's, I think we're gonna get to that eventually, right? Right now, we kind of have it balanced where they're paying about 10 million in, it's about a $10 million project. So basically, their capacity fees are funding the necessary project that we would have. Now, when, in the next year or so, as we update capacity fees, studies, and things like that, those projects will actually be incorporated in. And that would determine really, I guess, the percentage of how much they would contribute, right? But that would be, everybody else too. Anybody else who's tied into the system would obviously contribute some portion to that thing. But anything specifically related to the site would obviously be constructed 100% by them. But they are a main driver of the need for that lift station. But it's really just because they're going to bring it's the only significant development that's bringing flow. So
Mhm.
I would expect that it would be a vast majority of the cost of that station, but we've done 0% design so far, so
But-
that's.
The capacity fees would also pay for, buying into the existing conveyance system and the treatment system. And so this is like, to me, it's that extra thing. Unless it's in the capacity fee study already.
There were multiple projects in the existing capacity. I think that it needs an update. It definitely needs an update as we move forward. And that's something we'll have to look at too. If it is a main driver of a specific project, well, then that would fall more on. Yeah, where it might be a special assessment for a
Yeah.
specific development.
I'm just thinking, existing ratepayers shouldn't be paying for the developer to put in
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
system to serve their large.
Right.
Development.
I agree.
I mean, and it goes back to rates and what ultimately everybody's paying.
Right.
So everybody pays their fair share.
Right. And yeah, we agree. And so I think, as we do the
Okay.
capacity fee study, as these developments actually come through the door, those are kind of decisions.
So it's possible that
This will change.
yeah, yeah,
It will.
This
for
is
sure.
sort of a worst case scenario.
yeah.
It will for sure.
Yeah, we tried to reflect a net zero impact
Mhm.
on current rate payers from that development in this projection. So if it goes away or if they fully fund it, one way or another, it's not going to impact the rates necessary for current customers. Just reflecting, if we do the project, this is what
Mhm.
things look like.
I had a question. Will the old schoolhouse lift station then, the output dump into the old River Road pipe that was just improved? And does it have to be then increased?
Well, there are two projects downstream of that, and that's something we talked about at the CIP meeting last month. It would into Old River, and that goes to lift station 2, and then lift station 2 actually ends up on
North River Road.
And so we've talked about both of those. North River's more impacted. Old River, though, it does show that it filled out. There's requirements there as well, and that was in the 10%.
I'm struggling with the negative cash flow on the right-hand side of that equation. If the capacity fees in essence are going to cover the cost of the additional things, why is our reserve going to zero? I mean, going negative.
Because you have the North River project. in there
Yeah,
too.
there's another $10 million project. plus.
Okay. Okay.
On your next slide, where you've got the major assumptions, do you know what the assumption is for cost of water savings going to Eastern?
Yes, so we get into that on one of the last slides.
Okay,
I think it's overall 8.3 is what I'm saying based on the updated analysis. Before you take into some cost increases like the chemicals and the other things, but
Right.
pure cost of water savings, about 8.3 million
okay.
on a full year basis,
On a,
full 12 months. Yeah,
12 months, yeah.
yeah, since we're assuming half a year for next
Mhm.
fiscal year.
So it's 2 million a year? Or is it 10 million a year?
8 million a year.
8 million a year.
A year.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Just want to be sure I heard right.
So the big part of the discussion, how do we solve this? How do we have a path forward? And so there's a few different pieces to it. So I'll go through each major theme. So you see the whole of it together. So obviously we're talking about a cash flow issue, not necessarily an overall financial issue. We're talking about savings and other things coming in, but there is a timing of when we need cash. And so you've heard me talk about monitoring reserve levels and that us needed to take out a loan. And so that's in the works. It's scheduled to come to the board this month in a couple of weeks for approval for us to take out. But what that looks like, I'll get into more detail in just a few slides.
Question. Through all this, has CSDA Finance Corp been contacted for any suggestions of what they could do?
No. No, I haven't gone through any sort of conduit financing agencies, mostly because we need to do this very quickly. And then the other, because the rate that we ended up getting is very competitive in the market anyway. So if we were getting much higher rates, that might have warranted trying to
And what is that rate?
4.7%.
Thank you.
So the need up front is about 10 million. So that's what we're looking at. And that's going through our main bank that does, so to speak, our checking account and our business transactions. This started with looking at a line of credit, and usually your main relationship bank is the only one that'll give you favorable terms for that. But they were willing to do it as a fixed rate option with a very competitive rate. We had a municipal advisor verify that compared to the market. And so that's the 10 million and looking at doing that shortly. But that doesn't deal with the total amount that we need for the exit fee. If we finance that, that would be 15.8 million on top of the 10 million, not included within it. And so we've looked at different options there. Probably the biggest challenge with the exit fee from an economics sort of point of view is that it couldn't be a tax exempt financing. And so then you're dealing with a much higher interest rate. And then frankly, doing explicit debt the same way that we would do normal bank debt, 15 on top of the 10, our financials would look very strained and we would get even worse terms with the bank. And so because there is an option through the settlement, essentially to pay the water authority the 3.2 up front, that's due and payable immediately on detachment. But the leftover balance, us being able to take some time to pay that off, it just accrues interest, but it accrues interest at the LAIF rate, essentially what they would otherwise be earning in their investments. That rate is better than any rate we could get with the financing. And so we would save. And so the goal would be, since this exit fee is supposed to be replicating what they are losing on revenues, over 5 years, to pay them over the 5 years, the 3.2 million, just plus the interest. And so both of those combined give us the cash flow relief that we would need. 10 million essentially financing the rest of the 3 pump stations and our CIP for the next 2 years. And then the exit fee financing paying what would otherwise have come from reserves. And so freeing that up.
How long are your term of that 10 million?
10 years.
10 years.
This is probably a little left fielded, but I know that it has been discussed in the past, and I realize that this would probably be a matter that the board would need to consider in executive session. But in talking previously with Tom and briefly with Alfred, is there not still a question that we should not be compelled to pay an exit fee at all? And that we should say no, we won't pay it? There may be some litigation expenses. Hayden, I've talked to you about this in the past, and we don't pay it. And if there's a little bit of litigation, I doubt seriously we're gonna run up a $15 million tab in litigation expenses. And so I'm just putting it out there for thought. And we would just not kind of go public with such a decision until detachment had actually occurred. We were getting the water from and getting billed by Eastern, and then we would just say, nope, not gonna do it.
Well, we're in a public meeting.
Yeah, so you just made a public statement.
And I think, you know, even as we approach the settlement agreement, you know, when you look at this, and again, it's a cash crunch we've got up against us. But even when you look at the 15.8 million and you're going to see in Rick's pie chart later on, it's less than a 2-year payback. And so I think risking not paying it and staying in or something going sideways on that is probably a lot more risky.
Like lump sum up front.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I mean, it's really more of a long-term thing, right? We do have to deal with the short-term cash crunch. We put a provision into that settlement agreement. We have agreed to that settlement agreement also.
We've made a commitment.
And but that's why we put this in here, right? So that there was options there that we could manage our cash flow, but make the payment. I understand the previous argument that, you know, the CWA Act didn't specifically call for it, talked about, you know, just the tax roll would go with you and didn't, but the LAFCO resolution mandated it
Mhm.
and we've agreed to it. And I think over the long term, you know, we want to get there as quickly as we can, I think. And I think that's where we're coming from. I understand it'd be nice to save the 15.8 million. It's painful. It is. But it's worth it.
So getting into probably the heart of the issue and what do we need to do with rates, both near term and projected over the 5-year. So the backdrop and context is obviously you all dealt with the rate study and a Prop 218 notice and everything else last year. And that rate study was, what do we need, not considering detachment saving. So it's a great baseline for where would we be without detachment. And it projected a minimum necessary increase. And this included some CIP expenses and what have you, but 9% per year for 5 years. So that's the baseline of without detachment. That's what we thought we needed last year. So pretty good information. Looking at what we know now and essentially being able to achieve all the things that we need to achieve, including cash crunch and loan and all of that I'll get into. Because detachment hasn't happened yet, and we are low, still need a rate increase. But the good news is it doesn't have to be 9% July 1st. I think we can get away with 4.5%. So do half the rate increase, defer half of it to January 1st. And the good news is after that, and I'll get into it in a bit, is from there, I think we can skip to the next January 1st. So skip July increases altogether and just do January increases. And then that would not be 9% increases, they would be 4% increases after that. So cutting it down substantially.
Plus whatever met.
Plus, yeah, this does not consider whatever Met puts through because,
Right.
well, maybe by the end of this meeting, we'll know what Met's adopted for the next 2 years, but certainly they do this decision every 2 years. So we don't know. So that's treated as a pass through on top of this.
My only particular problem with going to a single year rate increase is the way we have it now is this is what we're charging you. This is what we're passing through, and it's very clear to the ratepayer that that's the situation. When you meld those two together, it's less obvious that we're only raising it 4%, but we're tacking on
Mhm.
Met or
Mhm.
Water Authority rate of 10%, you know, whatever. And I just think it might be, well, it's more painful for us, maybe, from a bookkeeping standpoint, to be able to keep that separation.
Well, the administratively, it's not that big of an issue
Mm.
for us. This is actually coming from trying to make it easier on our customers and their perception. Just being very frank, hearing the sort of conversations our customer service has. As much as we break out on our bills, that causes, in my estimation, more confusion for our customers.
Mhm.
Well, what's this portion of the bill and what happens when detachment, is that all going to drop away, you know? And frankly, having to do rate increases in the summertime, when water demand's at the highest, and that's
Mhm.
our portion, also isn't good.
Okay.
I've done rate increases at other agencies at the same time when Met does theirs. And frankly, it's just communicating simply. Met is raising the rates, let's say 6%.
Mhm.
And this impacts your bill, including our inflationary increases 5%. And I think that's all. I think that makes sense to customers. We
Okay.
just need to clearly communicate. I do think this will be a lot easier on them understanding what's going on. And then it's in the middle of the winter, so demand charges or volume charges aren't as impacted right away. So
Yeah.
that's where the thought was coming from, at least on the intent.
Yeah, the 4.5% is almost like the, I guess, inflation rate.
Mhm.
To a certain extent.
Yeah.
You know, I think people understand that.
Yeah, and
Not
certainly,
happy with it, but they understand it.
yeah, certainly trying to get to the 4% as the longer term sort of rate
Good thing.
increases was staying within inflation. And then it's not on the presentation, but once we get past the 5 years, even the 4%, you know, maybe 3.5, something like that. Once things start getting paid off, we have a lot more freedom at that point. So water rates, you know, deferring what was the 9%, half of that to January 1st. So that's the first bit of good news, at least what we were thinking of last year. And then from there, January increases by 4%. Wastewater, as I said before, isn't impacted by the detachment savings. So what we thought in the 218 and the rate study last year still holds. In fact, things are a bit more strained than what we thought last year by some margin. We've talked about this back build amount that we owe to the city of Oceanside. That wasn't contemplated then. And even there's a provision in there for us to be setting aside certain amounts for a replacement reserve that weren't included in that cost of service. And so that's like 400,000 a year. So point being is we need every dollar of the rate increases we anticipated for wastewater. And even then, it's going to be stretched over the next 5 years.
I'm just curious, we're having this 5-year discussion. So if we go back 5 years.
Mhm.
Were these discussions happening as well?
Everybody's looking at me.
Here.
Well, I mean, I
The
know,
answer is yes, in a slightly different format.
Yeah.
I don't think it was laid out quite like this, and there's some things in here I was surprised at to learn.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I know-
later, so
I know over the history of the district, I mean, every year, you know,
Yeah.
rate discussions occur. So I think so. I know over the last few years, you know, there was an anticipation that detachment was going to happen quicker than it
yeah.
actually happened. And so that I know that probably put some strain on what was going on. And so, you know, but I know, yes, I mean, I've looked back through, you know, 20 years of, and, you know, the rates get updated every single year. So I think they have been, we are in a very unique time. Though.
Mhm.
It's a unique time.
And the reason I ask is because I think this is best practice
Mm.
that we continue to have weekly reflection. So we're not waiting for 5 years to have this conversation
Yeah.
again.
Yes, it's certainly the intent that when we bring the budget information, you're looking at the near term, which is the next year, which is what you're adopting, and the decisions are officially being made. But you're looking at the 5 year to know what's right around the corner, because that does heavily influence a lot of what we should be doing today. And those are projections and not commitments, even when I'm talking about rate increases for the next 4 years. Those are projections. Yeah.
Hey, Rick, on the Prop 218, it says it was noticed for 5 years, so did the board approve just 1 year of those increases,
No,
but it's noticed?
we
or did
approved
they-
5 years so that we wouldn't have to do additional 218s.
So it's approved at the 9%, but the board can take an action
To
to
do less.
do less than that.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
That's what we're
yeah,
talking about.
right.
Okay.
And frankly, I would probably be bringing to the board anyways, the updated analysis on,
Mhm.
it can be less and, there we go. So.
Well, our thought was, when we approved it on the assumption that detachment wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
And so we based our projections on the next 5 years at what we thought the water authority would be doing, et cetera,
Mhm.
as a worst case scenario. And that eliminated the need for us to go back for another 218 unless something dramatic changed and the rates had to go higher. Okay. And our thought is if detachment approved, we'll be able to take less than that and we don't have to
Right.
have a 218.
So I know sometimes when there aren't regular rate increases annually to account for inflation, you get big number, double-digit numbers like that. Were there years in the past where that wasn't done and that's what we're seeing
We,
here?
in the first 2 years of the detachment process, we actually deferred any rate increases. And so we had to take a kicker to get back on track because
Yeah.
So-
Be good for customers. to
we,
know that.
yeah,
Yeah.
we.
So there was a break for a
Yeah.
little while.
Right.
Right.
A little pain right now.
Yeah, it was in the 218 and when I was talking about that, the kind of the balance of the three things, that was actually, it was in our November newsletter. It is what we've been trying to communicate. I don't know how many people read the newsletter. I think a lot of people do. But that we actually said that explicitly that the detachment, I mean, it really does provide savings and it's a long-term look. But yeah, we're a little bit of kicker from, we thought it was gonna happen faster. So that's,
Well, and I imagine with wastewater too, no rate increases during the pandemic was probably very helpful to a lot of the
yeah.
customer base, so. We're just trying to catch up. It takes a long time to catch up.
And I'm just glad that we're addressing it and we will continue to address. So there's no surprises.
Well, the last, and it's a detail, but it'll be a significant one to highlight. So the question we've gotten. So what happens with PSAR rates? And so right now we have two different rates for those that are on the program versus traditional ag customers. From a legal point of view, just on guidance and my working with rates for a long time now. So our constraint is as soon as the program goes away, we have no justification for having a different rate for PSAR customers. So you have a choice. You can either lower the normal ag rate below the cost of service. That's always an option. Not necessarily a good one, but it's a legal option. So essentially lower it to the PSAR rate. Or you bring the PSAR rate up, you meld them together, so to have a common rate. We did look at just the option of lowering. It's incredibly expensive. Obviously, this is a majority of our water sales. And so that's over $2 million a year. So it was not financially feasible even to look at. And so what the projection includes is the assumption that as soon as we detach, you meld the rates together. So it would bring ag down a little bit. That's mostly going to bring PSAR up to slightly lower version of where ag is now.
But of our ag customers, we only had like 20% on that were on PSR.
correct. I think there's 12 or 1,300 ag customers and then 200 or 300.
yeah.
200 or 300 PSAR.
It's just those 20% are the big users.
Yeah. The benefit that the PSAR users get though is the PSAR program is onerous
Right.
and it has costs associated with it as well. So I've actually, I mean,
They're gonna pay more, but they get better insurance for water
Well,
guarantee.
it's a very small sample size, but I've talked to a few of our pieces and I've communicated this to them. Hey, you know, really they were already at the bottom of the basement rate. But the good news is all those hoops that you had to jump through, the programs that you had to be a part of, certified organic and, these different things. You don't have to do that anymore. You're just going to get the ag rate that everybody gets. And there is some cost savings there. If they're a big water user, it's probably not going to, be a wash. But they actually genuinely seem pretty happy about it.
Yeah.
Now they haven't seen their new rate yet, so maybe that, we'll see. But I know the program is onerous.
Yeah.
So that was, there is a benefit to it.
So with the water savings at Eastern, does the water cost that would be melded there, is that still a savings for ag customers?
We believe the ag rate is
Yep.
going to go down. Yes.
It'll go down.
Yeah.
Even though they're not getting the special rate, it's still gonna go down because of the detachment.
Because the overall rate is going to be less.
Less.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
Okay,
So,
can you not be happy?
Well, but not the PSAR rate,
Right.
not the PSAR rate.
Oh, that's.
The ag
what
rate. This is the ag rate, not the PSAR.
Okay,
And when will that be anticipated to happen?
When we detach.
so
We have to do
assuming
that.
January.
We have to
1st.
do it. when
Yeah.
we
Okay, so
detach it.
January 25,
Yes, that's the
That's our
assumption.
assumption.
okay.
Carrie, and there are a lot of, what's his face? With the PSAR rate and talking with my neighbors, for example, that are commercial growers, a lot of them opted out of the PSAR because they can't, they were the first cut if there was a new water cutbacks.
Yeah.
And they were saying, I just can't live with that.
Yeah.
I'd rather go ahead and pay the straight up commercial rate,
Mhm.
than take the risk of
Gotcha.
being cut. So there are benefits by going to a straight ag rate.
And it will depend too on kind of timing. I mean, if it was actually January 1st, obviously we've got a Met increase that's going to happen that day.
Mhm.
So it kind of, but we have to do the ag thing as soon as the detachment occurs. So if it's before that, they're going to see something greater.
In December, here's your rate, and in January, oh, well, we just added another 13%.
Maybe.
Or whatever.
So combining the two rates, ag and PSAR, will simplify our books, right?
Right,
Simplify the books, yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a win.
Is there might I ask, as this gets presented to our ratepayers, 4.5% happening July 1st, 4.5% plus Met on January 1st. Would it be useful to contrast that with where we would be if we stayed?
Stayed.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
they're
Yeah.
the water authority is gonna be at something on the order of 10% before Met.
Mhm.
That's gonna happen in January.
January.
And that could increase their rates by 15
Oh.
plus.
Good point,
as
Bill.
I-
Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
mental gymnastics, but I think that without getting too complex, and that's the trouble with this. There are some ins and outs, but if we just stack up the things that we're assuming
Mhm.
and our savings and how that affects our rates.
Be nice
for
if you
here,
show it on the bill.
Right.
then characterize where we exactly would be with the water authority. Which we could project easily. That might be a tremendous help to the average ratepayer if
My
we can
my
make it
thought
simple
was,
enough.
your January bill this is what you would have paid with the
Water authority.
water authority. Here's your detachment discount.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
Here's what you pay.
I don't see anything illegal about that I'm aware of, but it would. And it would just be a great comfort to those who supported it all the way.
Yeah.
We talked an awful lot about over 4 or 5 years, how much our rates are gonna decrease. we couldn't have anticipated this met increase for sure. Nor
But
a huge
reality-
detachment.
Bill, the reality is that met increase would have hit you on either side
Mhm.
Yeah,
because the water authority would have tacked a percentage up markup on
Right.
that.
exactly. That was my question.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's the long-term story. I mean, exactly what
Yeah.
you're talking about. This is not, it's not spin. That is reality.
Yeah.
You know?
It's preparing for the future.
But I agree with Bill. We need to be able to clearly identify for the
Yep.
ratepayer. Here's the impact when you're billing with detachment.
Mhm.
This is the benefit you're getting for us making that change.
Could that be done? On the,
Would- we can certainly calculate what the savings would be. How we present that will take some brainstorming on the easiest way to get that message across to customers.
cause I like the idea. I'd like to start being prepared. And so when you do your January billing 25, I'd like to see that on there because in my district, I got a bunch of Looney Tunes in my district and they are really anticipating rate decreases. And if we could do something that shows, okay, this is what you would have paid, but now this, it's not good, but it's a whole lot better than what it would have been.
We'll
But
back with
it
something.
sounds like we have an interest in that.
Are we talking about? I like it, but I just want to be. Are we talking about something? Where we would use the tech to make it specific to each bill? To tell them exactly what their status would be?
Yes,
I would
Or
like
would
to
it be
see-
something more generic? I'm hoping we could actually try to make it specific to their bill.
Bill,
yes,
That's what you're,
yeah.
great. Thank you.
Got March.
come back with something.
Yeah.
Come back with
Yeah.
something.
That-
Probably got to dig a little deeper on that.
The one caution I'd throw up, just to set some expectations, is any change to the actual rates on the bill, even if we're being hypothetical, comes into Prop 218 issues. Anyway,
Yeah.
we have to be very specific with what we show is the rate on the bill.
But can't you
Even if
put-
we message on the bottom, overall savings or other messages, that's why we'll have to be creative.
Rick, I like your idea of taking it back and brainstorming with the team.
But can't you use approximate? 'Cause I mean, now you're not really given how much, just approximate you put on the bill, you know what I mean? So you're not really being a number, a hard number, you're just approximate. Does that make sense?
It's a unique idea. Let us dig a little
Yeah,
deeper. on
yeah,
it.
I think more
Yeah,
research.
we'll talk some more about it.
Ask AI about it.
I would hear.
See what they recommend. I mean, he recommends.
You know, the other scenario is, this is not a bill, this is your bill, you know?
Yeah.
So there are a few other things relating to rates to highlight for you all. One, we just talked about capacity fees, and so there is, at least from staff's point of view, going to be a proposal to adjust where our capacity fees are currently by inflation. Our last time that we assessed these were 2017. They haven't changed since then. And just going by construction cost inflationary index, it's been 25% of the construction cost increase since then. And so that would be the proposal in the short term. And then it would, most districts actually annually adjust, or at least many do, annually adjust these by inflation anyways. And so we do that going forward. And that would be until we get the master plan done so that we can do a more comprehensive actual study update. But this would at least catch whatever development happens between now and.
So Rick, your slides in the beginning that had the graph, did it?
Put this
did
into
it
consideration.
contemplate that?
Mhm.
Yeah, okay.
The good news for development occurring, at least on the water side, is once detachment happens, the water authority's portion of the capacity, which is almost $6,000 for 3/4 inch, just drops off. And so that would actually probably, it is more than what our increase would be. So it's still a net savings.
And if you're larger, 1 inch or bigger, it's even more. Like 26,000 for capacity fee on 1 inch. I don't remember what our portion versus the water authority
There's
is.
gonna be a window of time, assuming this all, these actions happen in July, there'll be a window of time where both are included, but then as soon as we detach, then portion.
The other, and I don't have all the results of this now, but you'll see it next month. Is so we have call it fee for service and individual things certain customers do. We haven't updated those fees and charges for a very long time. There are some that are very obvious that we're not recovering the full cost to do that. The example I used on here is, you know, for those that were coming back out after hours to turn the water back on because they haven't paid, you know, that's always time and a half for our staff. You know, you have truck and a certain amount of time, and we're only charging 75 now. That's certainly not enough, and it's not on par with what other districts charge. So at least the goal here is not to overcharge or somehow be making money. It's really just so that other customers aren't paying for what a customer does. So
Yeah.
they pay their own way.
Is to update.
Yes.
Does it make sense to do that? Maybe a little bit more regular?
Usually my practice in the past has been annually,
Mhm.
at least on the major ones. Every once in a while, you wait a few years for things that don't happen that often.
Mhm.
Yes. So on other actions tying this out. So this has been mostly short term. I've already largely addressed some of the longer term things. But over the longer term, and this is why we're looking at the 5 year, the other part of this is, well, what should we have in savings? And so there's a large discussion at the end on reserve targets. So the projections get us to what's a proposed total target. But we're also anticipated to need to issue debt again for funding our CIP. You'll have noticed in the CIP discussions in year like 4, we stacked up some of the larger projects then. And that was intentional. And so what that looks like, at least currently, is about a $13 million issuance on water and about another 12 on wastewater to be able to fund the CIP. If we get grants, we'll be looking at SRF loans or other lower cost, special like subsidized financing. All of that would just lower what the rates would be than what was projected here. But this is the base case going forward. And then you'll also see as part of the plan, and I'll bring this up in detail later, doing some accelerated funding on our CalPERS pension debt. It's a very expensive debt, which is why it's targeted. But what that does is actually provide significant long-term savings. So it makes sense to do that. And then I already talked about the transition, at least the proposal was to go to January one-time year increases. And we were looking at 4% plus MET rather than the 9%. Wastewater would still be the maximum will be included in the rate, which is 13%. So going over what does this achieve? At the end of this, if we do all these actions, what happens? And so what you get is an operations budget that is sufficient to deal with normal inflation. So it's you're paying for operations. We have a very healthy but needed CIP over the 5 years. That's almost $64 million. So you have real investments going back into an aging system. On the CalPERS side, we're cutting our payments down by half, at least in terms of time. So it would have taken us 20 years to pay off. It gets down to 10 years, and we're saving over $3 million out of that process, which will free up funding for CIP in the future. Even with the additional debt, we're still staying at healthy levels. We'd have coverage, our ability to cover our debt service over 2 times, which is healthy. And you're getting reserves to what the target says it should be by the end of the 5 years.
Rick, what is that target?
The reserves target, that will be at the end.
Okay.
It's a little bit more detailed discussion, but I will get there, I promise. And then obviously we talked about going from 9% rate increases down to 4 after. So to get into this, it does, since it's a comprehensive solution, there wanted to get some background over what did we promise for debt? How does that constrain us? And how does that impact the overall picture? I'll try not to get into too many details. That's why I left it mostly visuals to give impressions. But obviously if there are questions, we can get into whatever the interest is. So a few things, and maybe some of these weren't as highlighted before, but we have several debt issuances. The oldest ones come from the state, from the SRF program. And we have the newest one on the water side coming from Western Alliance. That was intended to help fund the 3 pump stations, but it just wasn't enough. And then a recent $5 million wastewater loan. So all of that being together, most of these, not all of them, are what is called senior lien or parity debt, meaning they're all at the same level of promise of protection to pay. And so they have similar terms, and those are the ones that I'm describing. It's a little unusual for a district. It's not unheard of, but unusual, but this is the way it is. That we have pledged our repayment on a gross revenue basis. Typically, districts pledge on a net revenue basis. So you at least give yourself the option to pay operations before you pay your debt service. This practically doesn't come into play often, but it's a distinction. And so that's what we have promised in the past, is that debt service gets paid before anything else gets paid. And so if we had to make decisions on what we pay versus not, which is not in the plan we have, that's fine. This would come into play. But it makes it very hard to break away from this with future lenders because they don't want to be at a lower level than existing lenders. And so we'll have to deal with this maybe in the future when we do new debt issuances beyond the current one. The other piece is that we have pledged that whenever we do our budgets, that you all will set a rate, our water rates and wastewater rates. This is applicable to just water, at enough to cover our debt service after we pay all the rest of our operations bills, and then still have 20% left over. That's the 1.2 times. So they wanted to make sure you can pay your debt service and then have a margin for error on top of that. But that's based on projections. So we get those wrong from time to time. And if you do, and it's not very wrong, there's forgiveness there. Where there isn't forgiveness is on the next pledge, which is if you want to issue more debt, you have to actually achieve the 1.2, but not just on next year's debt. At the highest level of debt payment you have in any year going forward for existing debt and what you want to take out. So that's called maximum annual debt service. So for instance, if our debt payment next year was 3 million, but our schedule, like our mortgage payment schedule, 7 years from now, it's $8 million because we have a balloon payment. You have to at least meet the $8 million plus a margin, not just next year if you want to issue more debt. And if you can't meet this based on real results, then you can't issue debt at a parity level. You have to issue it less promise. We call it subordinate. And what that means is at a much higher interest rate. And so this is where it's important in how we set rates to stay on top of things, because it will affect how much it costs us to take out debt into the future. And so those are the 3 major pledges, so to speak, when we issue that.
Rick, that was very interesting, and I just want to be sure I heard you correctly. If we're paying $1 million a year, but in 5 years the debt is due to be paid and there's a $5 million balloon payment, we need to have $6 million in our gross rev, net profit.
Yes, if you want to issue more debt before then, at a senior lien to take advantage of the lower interest rates. Yes. Now we don't have that, so it's not a real situation that we're dealing with, which is why we tend to budget at as much level debt service as possible. But yes, that's what that does mean. That's the promise.
Oh, that's very prohibitive, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
The only thing I wanted to highlight, so this graph shows our balances. So right now we're at a little over 30 million in total explicit debt to banks and the like, water and wastewater. One thing that we do differently than maybe larger districts is we tend to keep our debt shorter, 10, 15, 20 years. There's an advantage to that. One, you typically get slightly lower rates because longer term is usually higher on the curve. But the other is you pay it off pretty quick. And so just to highlight, by the time you get 10 years from now to about FY35, we have almost practically no debt or very little. And so you'll look at the debt service, which is the next one. I'll skip to this one and go back. You see in FY 36 that we're down to less than $1 million in debt service. And so what this means is we have a lot of free cash flow, and especially if you add in the exit fee payments disappear within 5 years, to start really investing into infrastructure without having to raise rates at all.
Well, that was my question, because in 10 years, some things will need to be fixed
Mhm.
as well. So we may still have debt, even
Yes,
we'll have new.
we'll have new debt. We already anticipate like the covers at the reservoirs
Yeah.
will need to get replaced.
Because I
There's
know.
lots of
yeah.
things we don't know that are gonna break.
Yeah.
We
Right.
need to do. And so this gives us options without having to raise rates to cover the new debt.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
One step back, and I just have this in here for those that love detail. Exactly what the balances are, what they are now, when they fall off, all of those kinds of things. Key on here is together, average interest rate of about 3.4%.
Before you go back, this is one of the things that surprised me.
Hmm.
I didn't realize that we had a $4 million debt on an albatross sitting up on the hill up there.
Yes.
And my question is let's get rid of the albatross, which would allow us to get rid of or reduce that debt.
Well, just for disclosure, part of our agreements to the state on the Beck Reservoir, it follows through with Morrow too, is that we cannot sell or do anything with that, and we have to keep it in good, maintained, working order, because they invested in an asset, and so they don't want you getting rid of the asset that they invested in until at least you pay off the debt. So
Well,
that would be a
but you could pay off the debt
you could.
by selling the asset, right? Or at least.
Yeah, so there's options. I just wanted
Yeah.
to, it's a more detailed discussion than
Yeah.
it might be. at
It's,
the surface.
it's either that or find a dang use for it, because we're basically paying for something that
Right.
provides no benefit.
Well, I think it covered probably costs associated with Morrow and the others. I think that's what you're actually paying.
Mm.
We didn't make any improvements. I don't think the improvements were actually made.
No, there are no improvements, but you still have
It's
almost a
like-
$5 million
Right.
debt.
Right.
That you're making payments on, and it's not doing anything. It's not contributing to the operations.
Yeah.
So-
But I think the debt contributed to the improvements that you did make. At the other residents. That's what I'm saying. I know.
It's serving us collateral.
Skateboard park.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good news is at least we're not paying any more. on this. We actually took it to non-active status.
Well,
And now we don't have to pay
we've
the-
struggled over the last 8 years to try to find some use for it, solar farm and all sorts of things. And, we keep getting dead ends on all of those. Maybe low cost housing, All I'm saying
I
is,
hear it.
Do we have an appraisal of what the land would be worth?
well, I don't remember the size, but it's probably at least a minimum of about 2 mil.
It's a good chunk of property. I think the issue you've got is you have a
This whole,
200
Yeah.
million
yeah.
gallon concrete reservoir on there.
Right.
So it would take a
A lot.
significant amount of money just to,
to take it out.
that dirt got hauled across the 15 freeway. Back whenever they built it, the 70s.
Mm.
It's a tremendous amount of earthwork.
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
actually-
but if they take out the bend and Montserrat Narrows, there's an awful lot of dirt that could be dumped into
You
it.
could say, yeah, needs fill.
Yeah. you feel-
Anyway,
Once-
that's my
once-
comment.
One
It-
swimming pool at a
4.7
time.
acres.
Yeah.
4.7 acres, that's what it is.
4.7?
Acres.
The
thought it was
property,
larger than that.
it holds
I thought it
much
bigger than
bigger.
that.
Bigger.
Oh, wait,
7.
yeah, near, I'm sorry. Oh, God, yes.
I think it's 7.
It's more like 30 or 40.
Yes, you're right, I'm wrong. I just saw the one where I marked candidate for sale, sorry. 27 plus 5, 32, 38, and 5, 43 acres.
Wow.
You're right, that's a big,
Big chunk of land. Granted, it has a big mountain on it too, but
So
anyway. Food for thought. I hate to pay for things I'm not using.
Yeah.
in looking at, so we just looked at existing debt, so projected debt over the 5 year. The most immediate one is one I mentioned we'll need to do shortly, which is the $10 million loan through US Bank. So this one will be a little bit different, and I figured I can go through the major details now if there's any questions, and then when you see it in a couple weeks, that'll be familiar to you. So it's going to start out as variable rate, and at a pretty attractive interest rate. So you take what is the benchmark variable rate, it's 80% of that plus a little bit for their spread. So today that would be 4.4%, just to give you to that, a little bit less than the 4.7, and that's for whatever portions we use in this variable rate period, which would last through the end of September. Let's say I didn't pull down the full 10 million to the last day, we would only pay 0.2% on that until then. So it gives us some options for when to pull it down. It may actually be advantageous to take it all out on day one, because we would earn 5.5% on it. So just throwing that out there. But it converts at the end of September to the 4.7 10-year fixed rate loan, but we would a little bit different. We would be making payments monthly on that over the period. So that's that one, and that's shown in this graph as well. And then I talked about that both water and wastewater, we need additional debt projected by about year 4. So this is what that looks like. You see some of the debt service compared to the other slide is now stretched out because we're looking at 20-year debt for that. So it goes out as far as FY48. But you notice that the overall debt service gets down to about the mid 2s once we get past the next 10 years or so, because we paid off most of that debt, which is that extra room I was talking about that we have for things that aren't on the schedule, which we know will come up going forward. So getting into the CalPERS discussion. So not reflected on that debt schedule is the CalPERS liability, because it's not through the bank, it's through our pension contract. And so when we talk about CalPERS liability, the short explanation for what it is promises of benefits for past service. We're not talking about future service, where what CalPERS thought that they would earn didn't work out. And so there's a deficit to meet that obligation. As of our last actuarial study, that comes out to about 10.8 million. So you add 10.8 to the 30 we have now, and that's about 40 or so in total debt. But it comes at an interest rate of 6.8% compared to the others. And it tends to fluctuate quite a bit because it gets updated with every actuarial. So if CalPERS does better than 6.8% on its investments in a year, that number comes down, and if they do worse, it goes up. But just to highlight, when it comes to paying for current costs, actually that's gone down, especially with newer employees, which is what we call the PEPR employees, to pretty reasonable amounts. So we're paying essentially a little less than 8% of payroll to cover pension benefits for most of our staff at this point, and I'm going forward. A little more than double that for older employees closer to retirement that are in the classic system or got in earlier. So all that being said, it's not a current issue. Those costs are reasonable. It's the past liability that would be helpful to tackle. And so what you see in this graph, the blue bars are where we would be regardless if we don't do anything in terms of annual payments. Last year was a little over 600,000 as a mandatory payment. It jumps up to 800,000 this next year. It will get up to 1.25 million in a few years at a minimum, and it might actually go even higher. And so the thought is, if we're going to end up paying 1.25 million anyways, and we have the ability, bring that up to next year. And so we'll start paying 1.25 next year, and then we just adjust that amount by whatever our payroll growth is. You just increase that contribution. And what that does for you is to bring our payments from 20 years down to 10 years and overall reduce our payments by over $3 million. And so, in that total period, so essentially you stop making payments, after about FY34. And so all those blue bars go away, and that frees up what we would have otherwise been making payments for, other priorities of the district. So,
Pay off 10 instead of 20.
Okay.
Is that are we in this situation because we were not funding our pension plan?
no, we're at,
This is additional liability, isn't it?
so we're here because we made the minimum payments.
Minimums.
The standard minimum payments. CalPERS investments didn't do what they thought they were, so this is
Right.
really, I think, on them, but we deal with the consequences. And so if we take a different approach to get ahead of it, we can reduce that.
Okay.
So,
This has nothing to do with the recent changes in the MOU
No.
concerning, benefits at retirement, that sort of.
This is strictly due to CalPERS returns.
Mhm.
And we're required to use CalPERS. We can't go to like a regular insurance company and
No,
No.
Yeah.
It's fabulous.
we're
This is
we're
it.
locked in.
this is what you got.
So that's debt. I'll stop there if there's any other questions overall with debt obligations, what we need to do before we get into reserves.
I don't have questions. I'm just very concerned about the debt levels.
Mhm.
And then I know that we have to take out this kind of bridge loan to get us by right now. I get that, and I get the the detachment payments. Future debt's very concerning, especially now with this conversation too.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that we want to do.
Actually, we need to do.
Yeah.
So reserves, which is all in the discussion of what should we say, and I will recognize that this is probably the area of the most opinion on just what the target should be and what it's based on, and so you probably have from me more of trying to explain at least where staff's coming from and the rationale, at least so we're talking apples and apples with it. So overall, when we're talking cash reserves, it's the gets to the issue of what I started with, which is we're running out. And so the question is, well, what should we have in there? And reserves are all about risk and protecting against uncertainty in the future. That uncertainty could be as simple as typically our vendor payments are 5 million, but all of a sudden we have a large insurance payment and now it's 1 million. And so did we have enough to pay that? To uncertainty on water sales? We budgeted 10,000, now it's 8,000 acre feet. So we have less revenue. Well, do you have enough in savings to cover the difference? There are lots of uncertainties especially for water district, where the vast majority of our assets sit underground. We don't know what state they're in because we can't see them or inspect them. And when they break, it's expensive to fix and they can damage things. So there's a lot of uncertainty with large payments that immediately have to go out the door when things do go wrong. And those assets are subject to our, a common known risk of earthquakes. And so you just sort of stack these things together. So what's the right balance between being prudent to have enough in the bank for enough dealing with uncertainty, and too much where you're raising rates for something you wouldn't necessarily need? And so that's what we're trying to strike the balance between. So how much we set in reserves is set by policy, and the policy is set by the board. And so currently we have a policy in the admin code. And part of what we're getting at here is whatever the discussion goes will be reflected in an amended policy to bring back to the board. But one of the things that's not talked about as much with reserve policies, and it's a point that I've directly worked on with essentially class action lawsuits on water district rates before, is so Proposition 218, the simple gist of it is we can't charge more than what it costs to provide service. And so if you think of that as expressly, here's our expenses, here's our revenues, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And so the only justification on a legal point of view we have for charging anything more then exactly what we think that we're sending out in bills is by a reserve target. That's our justification. And so if we don't have a policy that matches what we think we should be setting aside, for instance, if we have 100 million sitting in the bank and our policy says we only need 10, there are potential claims for saying, well, why haven't you reduced rates? And that's where that comes into play. So the policy is very important from a legal defense point of view, is all I wanted to highlight there. Already covered, there's tremendous uncertainty and risk. And so it's really a policy decision on how much risk we want to tolerate as a district coming from the board. And then just generally some practical matters. We should try and be as stable with our targets as possible. I'll use one example, which comes up pretty often, is there's often something called a capital replacement reserve. Often that target is based on the 5-year CIP. What we think we need a cash fund from the 5-year CIP, as if you're trying to save up for that. The trouble is the 5-year CIP changes a lot, even year to year. If you have one large project in there, we're technically saying we need to bring our reserve way up here, and then we said we don't need it as much. And so the more we get stable to plan around, the better. And so you'll see some of that reflected in the targets as well. And then obviously people have to implement this. So getting a little too crazy on the details doesn't help anyone from an implementation point of view. So you'll have here a structure for reserves broken out into 3 categories. Essentially minimum, where we really want to be, and where we can justify that we're calling maximum. Minimum is there's 2 types of reserves that would go into that. What we call working capital, enough to pay our bills, and then enough to have on hand to pay our debt. And so I'll get into more of that later. But what this kind of a structure would argue is we at least need that. That is critical level. If we're below that, there's real danger for being able to pay our most basic obligations. And that's where we would be under right now, and why there's an issue. On top of that are what we would say is where we should be. I mean, legitimately, I think where we should be. And that includes stabilization of reserves. So these are dealing with the uncertainties, not just paying our bills, but uncertainties. Pipelines breaking and needing to pay for them when we weren't expecting to, or just water sales being off, expenses being higher than we thought. So that's capital replacement and rate stabilization. Being able to deal with uncertainty and keep rates smoother while we transition to what we then know afterwards. And then in the end, on top of that would be, there are some things which are significant and that we know in the future, and we should save up for them if we have the chance to, but they don't happen very often. And so if we don't, it's not going to impact day-to-day operations unless something actually does happen. Big thing being like an earthquake, or if we have a huge project in the future we want to save up for intentionally, then we would do that here. So the next part of this would be, so how does that the policy sort of get implemented? What does this mean practically? And so what it would mean practically is every year you would get an update from me saying where are our reserves, where we would line up with these goals. And there are goals in how long to get to them. And so there would be some actions coming as part of the budget on what we would need to do to get to them. And then the board decides what you want to do. You don't have to do any of them. But at least there's a plan in place that we could implement. And so, for instance, if we're under our minimum target, this policy framework would say we should be there within 3 years. And we should budget very conservatively. You should probably consider raising rates to get to our minimum target. And so that's probably what the proposed plan would include. On the stabilization side, mostly, if we can get there within 10 years, 4 to 10 years, which is what the 5-year plan would do, then if we budget conservatively, we save windfalls that come in, and maybe consider rates, then maybe rates need to be raised for this if we can't otherwise get there. And you give yourself a longer time to get there. And the other one is something in 11 to 20 years. If you happen to get enough savings, then that's good. If you make no progress with that, maybe you consider raising rates. But it's not going to impact operations if you don't. So I'll stop there with these are the categories, the kinds of things that go into them. And generally when the policy framework would say, we should be trying to get there. If there's any questions, otherwise we'll get into detail on each individual reserve.
Has there been any history or thought or, other districts for some fundamental level of reserves being a pre-arranged line of credit? And I say that because in my mind, I see all the advantages and the benefits of reserves. To me, the biggest negative is that it's dead money. It's just sitting there. It's not doing anything. And if when we're having hard times
Mhm.
financially, rather than trying to pile up some dead money that we may or may not use, could we instead have a prearranged line of credit for $2, $3, $4 million, whatever that is, so that if we did have a big whoops, we've got a place to go without having to have a huge wad of money sitting,
Mhm.
waiting for a
Waiting for
use.
that situation.
Just a thought.
You could, and certainly in the private sector, that's much more common. The difference would be a few things. One is a line of credit costs money.
Yep.
And if we're at that low of reserves where we need a line of credit, it's going to be more expensive, just in general. And so the other piece, which is different for a water district, is when things go wrong for us, it's very expensive, very quick. Thinking of mainline breaks can be, hundreds of thousands, if not million, or you get a regulatory change and all of a sudden we have a capital project we need to do. And so that's where it's really just a philosophy difference, but having reserves earns investment income, which directly offsets rates rather than relying on a bank. And the only other thing I'd probably say to that is, having seen a couple of different market cycles on Wall Street and banking regulations, if you're relying on the bank to be there to fund at all times, sometimes that goes wrong. We saw regional banks in the last couple of years, several very large ones go out of business. And so there is some risk in relying on a bank for being your main protection. And so that's board risk question. But yes, certainly some businesses rely more on lines of credit when they need it than using reserves and cash to balance the
And
equation.
it's not totally dead money because it is earning interest, right?
It is, and that goes directly to offset rates.
We keep referring to raising rates. Will you at some time bring in for discussion and reflection other options that could be considered along with that we may have some access or some items that we could help to decrease some of this debt or to build our reserve by selling some, and that is there. I think there's multiple approaches and not just raising the ratepayers rate, but I'm sure you're thinking of that as well. What other strategies could we pursue?
Like a strategy.
Right.
Get rid of that. I'm sorry.
And I'm not putting you on the spot, but that is something for future dialogue with the team and with the board. What are some other that we have more of a bundle packet with just not just one, and that's raising the rates.
So certainly the sort of plan is we continuously look at those, and when they happen, they offset whatever we thought we needed to do as a rate increase. And so we'll be actively looking at how our grants strategy is going forward. Obviously, land in general and what we do with that, or even our strategy with what projects are needed. Way. And so the difficulty is when we do these kinds of projections is you can't count on them yet. And so we show it as if not.
Right.
This is just for to refresh my memory. So I want to ask Mr. Hamilton, and hopefully you're still here, Meg. We had this discussion, God, a year, 2 years ago, on ways to find extra income. And one of the ideas was floated out, what legally we're allowed to do was you tax on your property taxes, parcels of a water tax. And I remember in that discussion I said, that's a very good idea, because when I used to live in Temecula, in your property taxes, because I never figure out why I never had a trash bill. Well, your trash bill was on your property taxes. And so, and I can't remember what, there was a certain number that we were allowed, 16, 18. I mean, I don't remember exactly what it was. And we were supposed to look into that and whatever happened to that. 'Cause I thought we even voted to do it.
Yeah, there are some options on that, that when you lived in Temecula, just because I know this firsthand. They have what's called an ad valorem tax. And that was established because there was a major landowner that was a majority landowner that put that tax on there when they formed the district. To do a substantial tax like that, it would take a vote. You would have to actually get a tax. There are some options for putting portions of the sewer bill and things like that, but in essence, what you're doing is you're just taking it off the water bill and putting it on the property tax bill. I mean, that is what you're doing.
We have I think it's a $10 standby fee or whatever it might be. That's on all the property owners, okay? One of the discussions we had was it viable to raise that? Because there's all kinds of property that people own that are not tied into the system, and they're gaining the benefits of all the improvements we do to the district. Yet there's no way for them to contribute, I'll say equitably, the way everybody else has to, as we raise their rates, okay?
Yeah.
And I don't think at the time Tom was willing to try and tackle looking at that kind of because I think you can raise it to like $25, if I'm not mistaken, according to law. Maybe Alfred could give us some information on that. But there is, that as a potential avenue to get some revenue in the door.
Yes, there are some options there. I think we saw a presentation on that
Right.
too. A couple of districts that had but then taken that up. We haven't taken it up yet. So it is another option. I mean, it is another. It's it's the same ratepayers in essence. I understand the thought. Your property value is increased even if you're not buying water. Your property value is increased by having it available to you. So I get the thought on that. And that is something we can look at. I mean, that's something we can look at. But in essence, it is, it's just shifting one cost from another. Yeah.
Well, and I think some of us are attending the Aqua conference, and I'm hoping there will be sessions that we will be able to go and attend and hear more on different options.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have a few other sources of revenue. I mean, obviously we make some money off our property. We've leased the property up at the Bonsall Reservoir, and we've got some cell phone or cell towers and things like that. But yeah, I wouldn't say we're a property magnet. We have a few key properties back, which is a difficult one. And we've been looking at that. We have looked at those. Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is probably Beck as far as size wise and potential. But again, I mean, I think if you were to appraise that property, it would have to take into account what you would have to do to develop it. And that would be, not that it's not worth taking a look at, but the others are very small and really don't put a huge dent into, we've looked at these, a couple of those Bonsall Reservoir, the property next to Beck, really it's kind of a drop in the bucket. And those could be valuable properties in the future. We got to be really careful, I think, about what we do with that land. I think, yeah. But it's worth looking at.
I'm not saying give it away.
Yeah. Don't
No,
give away the
no,
farm.
Yeah.
And then for the tax discussion, just to put it out there. So for us, anything that we have now is because it was grandfathered in. Including we do have a parcel charge that's roughly 10-ish or so dollars. I mean, we're getting an exact amount. Even our share of the ad valorem from the county is something that was grandfathered in. Any increase of any type, you're looking at a 2/3 voter approval.
Yeah.
There is a constitutional amendment that'll be on the ballot this November that on an off chance might lower that to 55%. But even then, at a 2/3 level, it's nearly impossible. Just
Yeah.
especially for a water district, there's not good history there. So getting into each one, and there's a few slides on this. I'll touch on them briefly. Under this minimum target, really there's two types. There's working capital, which is what you need to pay your bills. Currently, our policy in the written admin code, it says you need 2 months worth of our bills, our operating budget, but you don't take into consideration the cost to purchase water, which is our largest cost, and it's also very variable. So it doesn't make much sense, at least from my proposal. We should be looking at 3 months, just all in our operating expenses. And that is very standard within the water industry, at least in this region. That's also what was included in the cost of service study. So that'd be right on par with that. On the debt service reserve, so what our current policy addresses is what we are legally required to do anyways, because we agreed to do this when we took out the debt, which was some of our debt says we need to set aside a certain amount just in case we don't make a payment. And then that reserve will be used in that case. But the proposed target would be that we have 1 year of all of our debt service on hand, less what we already have in those trust agreements for the debt. So let's say we have 5 million in debt service for the next year. Our target would be 5 million less the 2 million we have already sitting in a restricted reserve. So it'd be 3 is what we want to try and have on hand in our unrestricted reserves. And between the two of those, that would assure you have enough on hand at any point to pay your bills and pay debt service. So the next level is what I was talking about. It gets into assessing risk and uncertainties for the future. The primary one that gets talked about the most is what we call as rate stabilization. This is your savings account to deal with when things go different than what you expect on your operating budget. So if water sales are lower, if expenses come in higher, if we get a claim to pay, these kinds of things that we don't budget, that's what pays for those things. And so in the policy, we say we should be setting aside 10% of current water revenues. And the recommended change is it should just be 10% of water and wastewater revenues, because both of those deal with uncertainty. On the capital replacement side, so this one's probably the most different than what you've seen before. So I'll take a little bit of time to explain this. Right now, we don't have any target in the policy. We just say that whatever surplus there is moves over to the capital side. And so this is also the area of our most risk. And so we should deal with it directly is the recommendation. And so what this reserve would do is it would handle the uncertainties that we don't have in the CIP plan. So all of a sudden we're doing a project and we realize we need to repair this, but if we're going to repair this, we might as well repair the whole block, right? All at one time. And so we didn't plan for that. So this reserve would cover for something like that. We had an $8 million estimate on the bid, so that's what we budgeted on, and it comes in at 10, right? So where does that money come from? It would come from this reserve. Things like that. So if you have uncertainty in your CIP expenses, this bridges the gap, and then you can sort of reassess things going on rather than it just being a straight rate increase to cover the difference. So how we would go about it is to say, if this is really about being measured up against the size of our assets in case something goes wrong, you look at, well, what's the replacement value of our system? We did a study, I think in 2016, and so I inflated that to today because it was a pretty detailed study. It's a best guess. So this is not historical value, it's replacement value. And that's about 920 million when you include the 3 pump stations and the lift station that we're adding on top of that. So you have a system that's nearly $1 billion, and at any point, some part of that may break and we need to replace it. And it's getting older. So if we just have 1 year of depreciation, like 1 year of useful life, on that, assuming that our assets are on average 75 years, which for some is maybe a little short on some pipelines or other things, and for some they're much less than 75 years. So just as a general average, you could just set aside 1 year of depreciation or value of the system for this. At least you're staying in proportion to the size and cost of the system. So that's what this goes.
So what is that 1 year?
About 10 million.
10
10 million.
between the two?
Yeah, between the two. And then these other ones, as I said, this would be more of the wish list reserve. We call them the maximum target. It justifies it if we happen to get money in. But the one is an emergency reserve. And so what we propose to do there is this reserve would deal with if we do have an earthquake. There is a real risk, and Arlene can attest on the details on the insurance side. But if you didn't know, none of our underground assets are insured at all. At all. They can't be. Nobody will do it.
Do it.
So if we have an earthquake and there's any damage there, what you're really relying on is FEMA's good
FEMA.
graces to cover some of this, and they don't always. And if you're relying on FEMA, which would make a national disaster declaration to come into play, they take forever to pay you. If they pay you 100%, and usually it's some portion of that. My experience is 3 to 5 years if you're lucky. So in the meantime, you're shelling out a lot of money to repair things and get them in good order, at least to get the system up. And if you don't have a giant line of credit or some other thing to deal with this, you're going to be emergency going out to issue debt to try and do it. This helps cushion some of the blow until you get reimbursed or until it makes sense to go out and issue debt. And so that's what this reserve would do. It's 1 more year of that replacement value to be in proportion to the system. And the last reserve is just if we have a project that we want to intentionally save up for, we would do that. It's not a specific reserve, it's case by case. So when you add these all together, so this graph is to show you on the left side is where are we now with our targets, not our actual cash balances, just our targets. And the policy target in writing now would say we need to have 8.6 million in the bank, which is already less than the 12 million we have now, and obviously is not enough to handle what we need to do. So if you look to the right, that's where we should be according to this framework. The yellow is what we're really targeting, which is why it's called target at 29 million. If we can justify through the policy going up to 41, and so that's why it's shown there. But 29 is really what we're going after when you start stacking these things together. The red would be those operating sort of working capital reserves and the debt service reserve, and the yellows are the 2 stabilization reserves. So just to put into perspective, because there is a concern, as I mentioned in the beginning, of too much in reserves, right? Well, as a standard, a highly rated water district, so this would be your Ranchos and Easterns and Westerns and other San Diego agencies, typically have almost 2 years worth of their operating expenses in reserve. So if we followed the same standard, we would be looking at 70 million to compare to comparable other districts that are highly rated and issue debt often. And we're looking at really 29. So this is, less than the average, but I think with how we do things with debt, that's okay. And we don't need to get up to the 70 million.
Can I say one thing too? Just looking at the left side, what the current policy is, I know just because I went through this when I first came on, that I think the board last year had verbally indicated that, yeah, the actual change in policy to include the water cost in the operating reserve, that's actually not reflected here. So I think the practice is actually what you guys stated you wanted to do is a little actually higher than that, but it was never codified it was never put into the admin code. So
Right.
yeah, so that just one item note.
And this is
Thank you.
very similar to what you saw in the cost of service study. So a little bit different definitions and practices, but it's in the same line as that. Other sort of little details, if this is agreeable to the board and we brought it back to change, We have two reserves that are in the code now that are kind of interesting. One's called a new water resources reserve, where we set aside a portion of property taxes to try and fund future new water resources. The cost of service study and frankly, everything, because our cash is so low, said we can't really afford to do that. And we don't really have any specific water resources we're going after anywhere at the moment. Not to say that can't change. So that, and then we have $100,000 sitting aside as a risk reserve for claims. But that was really based on our old insurance situation where we had $100,000 deductible. We don't have that anymore. So both of those don't really have a justification to exist at this point. So we just recommend simplifying the whole thing and getting rid of those. So if the proposed policy would do that unless there's any concerns. And so I'll stop there because this is the big part on reserves and where the target would be. If there's questions or comments.
Is the red area, the 10.6, that's actually the operating reserve
Yes,
or
that's
working capital reserve?
The recommended one.
the recommended.
And then the 1.6 is the debt,
Mhm.
which is the requirement in the debt covenant.
So that would be above what's required in the debt covenant, because not all of our debt has that requirement. So
These colors match back to your evaluation charts, minimum contingent.
right. Yeah, red being critical for us to have, not dangerous, but critical. So this would be that example of if our debt payment next year is 5 and we have 2 in the bank, that's restricted for debt, then that would reflect 3 as the difference to get up to the 5. So that at least we have between the two 1 year's worth of debt service on hand.
Okay. And, I'm still getting caught up, up to speed on how the budgeting works, but on capital replacement, there's no like, dedicated revenues that come in?
No.
Just to go to capital, it just goes into a reserve to meet the target. Well, there's no target, you won't set a target.
Right. I can say.
Part of that's because we've deferred all of that
Right.
because of revenue.
So if you're not setting aside an annual amount, your system is continuing to
Age.
depreciate and age, and it's not keeping up with
Mhm.
the rate that it's deteriorating, right?
I will
Yeah.
jump in. I remember when the board was considering a package of 5 years of rate increases, which we then subsequently did not. We implemented the first year. We did not implement any of the subsequent years
Mhm.
of those. I do remember that part of what we were telling the ratepayers is that even though we knew it was not the biggest amount in the world, that the major impetus for that set of rate increases was to generate an average of $3 million a year for capital replacement. But it was not in any way had a fence around it or anything like that. But I just remember that was part of the messaging that we did, was we were looking to establish 3 million a year as a bare minimum for capital replacement.
It's true. I never codified.
So I can tell you last year's results where we had, I'm gonna say less than $1 million left over after paying operating expenses to fund CIP. So that's where we are today, less than $1 million. Obviously not nearly enough. So that's all I have on reserves. The last few slides, and there's just a few, are really just visual highlights of where this takes us. There's not much detail. So I'll leave it up to you all if you can get through the.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break?
Okay.
We've been going almost 2 hours here. Sure.
Thank you. President.
Mr. Big.
Yeah, oh yeah, so yes, so Phil Forbes been ratepayer property owner about 40 years here, so I've want to thank the board for being willing to do what you do. it's challenging. You have a lot of challenges ahead of you with rate situations and the rest of it. I'm very encouraged to see that you brought real professional staff in here, and Mr. Wiley, Mr. Aragon. I didn't meet these individuals until this morning, but I know of their background somewhat. So I don't really have anything to contribute. I have some questions and stuff, but well, one question would be, I live up, my wife and I live, Debbie, we live up above Montserrat Winery. So on Via del Robles, which director represents that area? You do, Director Hale? Okay, thank you. So I might contact you at some point with a question or something. And yeah, you have a lot of challenges. There's going to have to be rate increases. You need more money. There's absolutely no question about it. You've got staff and consultants likely that are going to figure this out and help you with that. So, and I apologize for the way I look. I'm kind of casual, which is pretty much what I am every day. So please keep up the good work, the hard work. There's people out there that appreciate it. And that's really it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming and hearing this. Yeah, everyone, let's take a stretch break. Break. Right, Pete, we need. Rick, very nice. I think if anyone, Rick, you.
Yeah.
Would you? Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing us to stretch.
You can get up and walk anytime you want. Okay, the
Good.
floor is back to you.
Are we able to talk about the reserve
Yes,
issue before we move on? I just had a question about the emergency reserve as it relates to the capital replacement reserve, because it seems like emergency is for capital replacement under a disaster circumstance. And I'm wondering if the capital replacement reserve could, if they could function like as one reserve possibly?
yes. So certainly, if you had a disaster, you would go first to the capital replacement reserve. The
Yeah.
question is whether that's enough.
Sufficient.
And which is why the real target stops there. And the additional reserve is that we think it would, if we had the funding, it's more than justified in these circumstances to hold on to it, which is where that comes into the Prop 218 justification. But our real goal is the 29 million, which would just be the capital replacement reserve, especially when we're looking at setting rates.
Right. I know that, like I said before, there's a lot that we're trying to accomplish in a short period of time, and I'm very supportive, of funding the infrastructure and making sure that there's adequate money going to that. And I'm wondering if there's another way that that can be directed to that infrastructure, rather than putting it in a reserve under this period of the target level or the maximum target, to somehow change that at some point once we start getting back on track.
In other words, if I'm understanding you correct, you're saying maybe defer this for an out year as opposed to moving on it immediately?
The
The
target
emergency.
reserve.
The
Yeah,
emergency reserve.
yeah. Cause I think that's $10 million. And I think if it was directed to the capital programs rather than into a reserve, it would go a lot longer towards what we're trying to accomplish with the capital program. Is
So-
what I'm
so-
thinking.
So just to clarify, and hopefully this addresses your concern. So the rate increases that I was talking about, the 4.5 and 4.5, and then the 4% going forward, only are intended to fund the target level. They don't go any bit towards above that. What you'll see on the graphs is we go temporarily above that just because we issue debt and then we spend the money on the projects, but that's not raising rates to fund the green, so to
Okay.
speak. There's no rates in there. to
So the
fund green.
emergency is actually in the green.
Yes, that's in the green. So we stop at the yellow in terms of rate
Okay.
increases.
Okay, so when we do get to that target level, the rate increases, are they also then funding some aspect of the capital program, or is that?
Yes,
Yeah.
so
It
what
is.
you have
All right.
in the plan is
Capital
the
replacement.
rates fund what we have planned in the CIP for all the projects. What we don't have enough is in terms of cash flow, we debt fund for, and then the rates cover the debt service, and then the little bit extra on top of that gets us to that yellow target. So yes, you're paying for what we planned on the CIP, inclusive of debt, and then what's left over is what's getting us to the target. Once we get there, then that's after the 5-year period. That's when you can reevaluate what your rate increases need to be, because you already have your reserve funded.
So in essence, you've got 64 million in CIP. Rick showed, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but he showed about 24 million in debt,
Mhm.
13 and 11.
Yeah.
23, 24 million in debt. So the rest is funded. Yeah, you're funding 40 million of CIP plus the reserve.
Mhm.
Jump in, little bit.
Well, and you had 10 million in, sorry,
No, go-
It's,
go ahead,
you
go-
had
yeah.
10 million in the
Wastewater.
the capacity. 10 million
Oh, yeah.
capacity too. So 30 million, 30 million in CIP, 24 million in debt, 10 million in capacity, and another 12 million for reserves.
Mhm.
Basically targeted towards the capital program.
on that chart, I'm kind of looking at the red zone.
Mhm.
And I realize that there are kind of rules of thumb, or what do you call it, standard practices. But when I'm looking, first of all, the debt service, I'm guessing is the 1.6, is that
Mhm.
right? Okay, cool, got that. So the rest of the red zone is the 10.6, right?
Mhm.
And that is a function of 3 months of operating, including water purchase and excluding depreciation.
Yes,
Is that
you
correct?
got it.
And I guess where I'm going is that when I look at a reserve, I think about a prudent reserve as something that you might need to tap to handle unforeseen circumstances,
Mhm.
right? And so I say, well, we've got 60 or 90, whichever flavor you pick. We're basing the sequestration of money on some kind of an event which is predicated on us receiving zero revenue for 60 days, minimum, maybe 90 days. What event would that be? That could be a catastrophic earthquake, it could be massive fire, it could be a huge explosion that causes us to be unable to deliver any water at all and therefore receive no revenue at all for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the benchmark is we have here. And I've worked with a couple of entities which are not in this business, but a different business. And we looked at a prudent reserve in the context of over the last 5, 10 years, how much money on an annual basis have we needed to pull out of reserve to apply to unforeseen circumstances? And we took that amount of money each year and we averaged it, and then we increased it by a multiplier, let's say 25%, 1.25%. And we said, based on real use
Use.
of reserves,
This is our.
this is
reserve.
how much we need to set aside. And it was pretty substantial reduction from the amount of money that we were then able to free up and put to work. And so I'm just putting it out there. And now it could be that because we're a water district and there's banks and laws and God knows what, that we have to use that calibration. But if there's any thought, or if there's anybody here that thinks that maybe we could look at a different calibrating device for determining what our working capital reserves would be, that could also be something that we could look at as we assess other reserves. Okay, just a thought. Because again, if we're cash hungry and we need
Yeah.
money, this is a
Yeah.
way potentially to put money
Back to
call it
work.
dead money. I mean,
No,
yeah, it earns a
put-
little interest, but
Mhm.
Put it back to work.
that doesn't rev my motor, that we make a little
No.
interest. Taking dead money and putting it to work. So it's just a thought.
That's a little bit about what I was trying to get at, too, was.
And again, I think we talked about it, right? Our tolerance of risk, right?
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Are you worried about a cyber attack? And yeah, you don't get any revenue for 3 months. I mean, I think the 60 to 90 days is kind of standard industry
Yeah.
practice, just because, it's almost like your savings account at home, right? And you might
Mhm.
follow
Mhm.
Susie Orman, or you might follow, somebody else, but.
All depends on how close to the edge you want to live.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's really just, it's your safety net. And for a district with, that's gonna spend 40, $50 million a year on operating costs, having 10 million kind of buffering any unexpected disruption. I think that's what it is. But it can be 60, it could be 90.
Are you aware of any water districts that take an approach like Flint has just talked about?
Not,
Probably not.
not government water
Not,
districts.
not
Yeah.
government.
Yeah, the other thing, and I'll highlight this is, so one, to give you our comparison against what we're talking about versus what is typical.
Yeah.
With water districts. I mean, typical would be 70. So that was me trying to be balanced here, but, so the other one, which comes more into play of not the situation of, all of a sudden we're not getting our water bill, income, although COVID throws off assumptions too with that, but
Mhm.
it's really, when our payments come in, when is cash going out? And that can be highly variable in a year. So for instance, what isn't reflected in the operating expenses of 3 months is our CIP spend. And so you might have a very large project that spends 60% of it in 4 or 5 months.
Yep.
And so we're spending millions after millions after millions, and the rest of the year it's not so much. And so this doesn't take that into consideration. So it does by making it 3 months of operating, is that's a good rule of thumb, that that's going to handle both needs. You don't need to have a separate reserve for your CIP spend if you have 3 months of operating. Like right now with both projects, the 3 pump stations, the lift station, we're spending cash real quick.
Quick, yeah.
Much more than we would typically do just our normal operating expense spend. So that also covers this, and that's part of it.
And those bills are coming due pretty quick.
They are. That is, love sending them my way.
Yeah.
So if we implement these changes, where does that put us? So on the combined basis, this is the different picture. And so again, the green is the major piece here that we're looking at, which is the cash balance. The bars now are the target. So the red would be that minimum balance, the yellow would be the target, what we're really going after, and the green would be the maximum. And the overall point is to say is both water and wastewater combined. By the end of the 5 years, we get to the yellow line. You get a temporary bump up, and that's because we issue debt, but that's to spend down in the next year or two. And so that's why it comes back down. After there, we would intend for the green to stay around the yellow line. It's going to dip and come up a little bit, but that's what you're going after. You see the debt issuances with the big green bar. That's what I highlight out there. But you also see how much variation there is month by month, depending on when things come in. So, and then just to get into the water versus the wastewater picture, the water carries the day because it's the vast majority of the financial activity. So it looks a lot more similar to the last slide. Again, you have a little bit more than the target reserve by the end of the year. If I showed the next year, it would get down to the yellow line. That's the whole point. Wastewater, I wanted to explain a little bit more, and this is mostly to draw home the point. You see in that middle section, the blue line is revenues and the bars are expenses. We're riding the line on what's coming in versus what's going out. And so the next 5 years, we need to get through the next 5 years with wastewater, and that's with the rate increases. That's paying off our past due balance to Oceanside. That's what we need to set aside for a reserve for them for our share of their capital replacement. It's the debt we might need to take out, although that's taken care of in those ones. So if we get capacity fees in from development, that'll change the picture in years 3, 4, and 5. But until we know better, then here's the projection.
Question for you. I thought, Rick, maybe it was you that were showing what other recently in a board we were showed what other agencies were paying, and I thought on wastewater our ratepayers were like 50, and then you showed I think it was like Fallbrook, and Fallbrook was like over 100.
Yeah.
35, 135.
Yeah, and we're so much lower than everybody.
Yeah, we are.
Why can't we raise our rates?
Well, this gets us up to probably the upper limit of San Diego County by the end of year 5. From there, I think we get to pare that down quite a bit. So we have catching up to do, just to put it simple. And so we are maxing out what we said in the notice. If we wanted to do it even faster than that, we would have to send out a new 218 notice, so this is living within what we told our customers.
So this is doing the 13%.
Well, actually, what we are addressing is what we did not do. And we are now recognizing where we are and correcting it to be on better alignment for where we would have been if we had been addressing it in years past.
Yeah, well, we did 35% last year, I know, which is a big jump. But I do remember the graph
Yeah.
that you're talking
Yeah.
about that showed we were still at a lot of
Bottom half,
something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, we've got some room to move, I think.
Does the blue line include the 13% per year increase?
Yes.
Sure.
What it does show you, so wastewater is between right now 4-ish million a year in revenues. So when we talk about large CIP expenses, it in context to what we're bringing in with rates, it's huge, which is why everything, our normal operations look so small in the graph, because a $9 or $10 million project is significant.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. But the plan should work, and we'll be monitoring it. The other factor, just to outline, is of that 4 million, about 1.6 goes to the city of Oceanside for treatment. And that we don't have control over. So we need to be, that's part of the contingency. It's just part of the operations. So the last slide is what did we think we're going to save on detachment? Where is it going? And so the updated numbers, and I think this is better than what we thought before, since numbers are more refined now. But on a full year basis, of which next year is only a half year basis, on a full year, 8.3. But then we have some additional operating costs that eat into that. Obviously the electrical costs for the pump stations, that's about $500,000. Chemical costs, we're currently thinking 800,000. We'll see how that really turns out. And so that eats into that number by, is that 1.3?
16%.
Yeah. Obviously for 5 years, we have the exit fee payment. That's 3.2 to 3.3 with interest. That goes away after 5 years. So that's good. But in the next 5 years, that's 40% of the savings. Obviously, we talked about issuing 10 million in debt. That's 1.3 million that gets tacked onto the bill that would come out of the savings. We're trying to be strategic with the CalPERS debt. That's about an extra 400,000 for 10 years, and then that drops off. And then the rest, 1.9, is what's really going to bring that 9% rate increase down to 4% in the long term. And so that's that last, the green, about quarter,
Yeah,
third to a quarter.
22% or so.
Right. So just the simple breakdown of where is this all going? And then just to wrap up, so the next major action items, the $10 million loan come before the board in a couple weeks. The May workshop will get into the details of the actual operating budget, so you have a chance to look at that with any actual rate adjustments on capacity fees or fee for service. You see what those really look like. And then the June board meeting would be looking at the adoption actions. And then I'll take any questions or direction.
Thank you for this presentation. It's very knowledgeable and well thought through. I would like to recommend that in a future conversation, as we do increase the rates, that we may have some ratepayers that will be very significantly impacted. And I would like a conversation of what we can do to support them in the transition, that they will be successful in being able to pay their bills, and that just some assistance that may be needed to help them through this process. Thank you.
To what extent?
That, I think I'd be happy to serve on that ad hoc, but I think to discuss, we have ratepayers that are on fixed incomes, and to just to open up a conversation of what we could possibly do to support them in this transitional time. And I don't have answers, but I think a conversation would be beneficial.
Yeah, this is just a comment. First, I want to thank the general manager for hiring Rick, because I see a huge difference over the last 7 years of having a finance director that gives us information. And I want to thank you, Rick, that you've enlightened me in a lot of things that we haven't really, as directors, in my opinion, been given details to, or not as detailed of details that you go through. But I want to thank you. It's better late than never that to find somebody like you can lead us into the direction of where we should have been for a long time. So
I concur.
And I add to that.
Yeah, I appreciate that you've really come up to speed in a short amount of time
Yeah.
and put this together. It's been really good. I would like to see a little bit more info on the new water resources reserve and what the impetus was to creating that, to see if it makes sense to um eliminate that before we move forward with a policy adoption to
Mm.
change that at all.
Yeah.
I'd just like to understand that a little bit more.
Historically, over the last 8 years, we've looked at any other types of resources, recycling, groundwater studies, and things
Mhm.
like that. And it all penciled out to be more expensive than what we were paying the water authority.
And those studies actually, they are available.
Yeah,
Yes, I
they're
know, I
in
requested
Board
that.
Effect. You can go back and find.
Yeah, the real, so that's exactly, there was just a dedicated revenue stream cut out to save up to look at different options. So the thought would be whether we needed to still have a dedicated revenue stream, which would take away from the numbers here, because that commits all of it. And otherwise, we would just put in the CIP as something that we're gonna be looking into as on par with the rest of the priorities.
Right, well, maybe that's, a suggestion is that it just go into CIP instead of specifically to water resource development.
That would be my preference.
Mhm.
We're not gonna stop looking. at this. I mean,
Yeah.
Conditions always change.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'll make that commitment. That's not something we just, that's behind us, something in the past. So
Mhm.
Yeah,
I understand the studies that show what they showed, but there's always new opportunities and things. Always.
That was how we got the
Yeah.
detachment, Carrie. We exhausted every possible way we could get extra water.
I'm gonna, jump in here. I'm gonna be a little persistent. I'm still suggesting strongly that the red zone does not need to be so big. I heard what Rick said. I heard you loud and clear, Rick. But if we have a CIP project that is running up big bills and change orders, we have a thing called the stabilization target level, the capital replacement funding for unanticipated capital asset replacements and project escalations and unbudgeted CIP cost increases. So we would be reaching into the yellow zone to pay for the kind of stuff you were talking about. And I realize that a reserve is a reserve and you could call it a banana. I get that. I get that. But for us to get to a place that is being suggested to us to achieve the yellow zone, that's where we want to get to the
Yellow
yellow zone.
zone.
One way to get to the yellow zone is to make the red zone not quite so big and make the red zone be far more reflective of what is actually going to get spent out of that reserve. And so far, I'm just not hearing that we're gonna spend $10 million out of that reserve on anything that qualifies for that reserve. And we have rate stabilization, we have capital project, and so reserves are reserved, but I just think we could get to the yellow zone a little faster if we made our red zone more appropriate to what is really likely to be the use function there. So, and then I'm gonna let it go.
I have another request too. In one of the slides, you had stated that you would present the status of the reserves to the board annually, but I'm wondering, since this is a pretty big issue for the whole district, if we need to have something monthly in the board packet that just speaks to where we're at and how we're doing month to month. You know,
So we do,
in the financial
It already-
report.
yeah, so I can definitely add some more information to the treasurer's report. It tells you exactly where our cash balance
Yes.
is. But putting it in context to the targets, I think would be more helpful with, okay, so that's the balance, but where did we say we should be? And yes, I think.
Yeah, and are we making progress or do we need to make changes, mid-year?
Mhm.
Based on how it's performing or how we're doing? I like that we did the budget adjustment and changed.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, this seems like this could be similar to that. Mhm.
Just to go back to Clint's comment too, because we were talking about 60 to 90 days. So the 90 days gives you the 10.6,
Mhm.
right? Where the 60 days would be 7. You're talking somewhere in there is about $3.5 million. That's the delta, I guess. from
I
the
don't know
current
what it would
practice.
be because under the method I was proposing,
Shows
you
you
would
be
go
a
back
lot
and
less.
you would look at how much each year did we actually draw out of that reserve to pay for unanticipated operating expenses.
Expenses.
And then you'd
Mm.
average
Use
that
the
and then
factor,
you'd
you
plus
think.
it up a little bit and it could be that we only need $2 million in there. I don't know. It's, you just let the data talk to you. That's the way I'm looking at it.
I hear you. I hear you.
So the only other thing I would say to that, just laying it all out there.
Rick, let me just jump in. Hang on. Yeah, one here. I am also aware that our ability to get some bank loans and some revolving fund financing may hinge upon us having more
Yeah.
dead money than we need. I get that. I get that. And you can tell me that and I'm ready to shut up on the topic.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Say-
Telling you to shut up.
Took the words right out of his mouth.
Which is what I was trying to get at with the 70 million number.
Uh-huh.
Is when we go to get loans, whether we're officially credit rated or not, the banks look at two things. How much net revenue do you have to cover the debt service? That's the debt service coverage. And your liquidity, which is how much money you have in the bank. Those two things will drive what interest rate we're paying. So not that they won't lend to us, but and that's just the decision the board has to make. If we have less cash, we pay more in interest. Not only do we earn less interest, but we pay more in interest. And it's not a 1-for-1 sort of ratio, but that's the most direct consequence is they're going to look and say all of your neighboring sort of competitor, well-run agencies would have an equivalent of 70 million. You have 30 to 40. And so we'll pay a little bit of a penalty for that, but it's not that much of a penalty. That's why I think we can get away with 30 to
Not
40.
with raising rates.
And do they
Not with
look-
raising rates, yeah.
Do they look at the sum total of the red zone, the orange zone and the yellow zone, or are they looking at?
The
They're looking
actual
at
number,
total cash balance.
total cash balance, yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how we categorize it, calling it banana,
All reserves.
whatever,
All they care.
all reserves. So they're gonna say you should be at 70, right? And we have our justification, that's fine, but that's where that comes from.
I understand.
You know, we have a brand new specter on the horizon when it comes to the reserves, and that is pandemics.
Hmm.
And, you know, there is
Mhm.
nothing to say that COVID-19 is going to be the only pandemic that comes down the pipe that's going to freeze the economy, create rate stabilization fund went bye-bye during this pandemic when we had to deal with so many people unable to pay. And so, you know, that's going to be a new factor. And, you know, that's why you can never really just rest that there won't be a
Mhm.
nuclear exchange, there won't be a something. And who knows what North Korea is going to do. So we do need to think in terms of the modern world and what's changing it too. When we're start talking about this, and I get your dead money point, but there's more danger, I think, in what we've seen in the last 20 years than there has been in a long time since World War II.
A lot more than
Yeah, I
And-
concur.
And we have to think in terms.
unfunded mandates coming down from Sacramento and.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Oh,
that
there you
we're in the state of California.
One thing we didn't talk about too, and you know, is sometimes there's opportunities that come along when you have some cash
Yeah.
on hand as well.
Yes.
Or I guess the
Mhm.
problem is if you don't have the cash on hand,
Yeah.
it's hard to take advantage of when opportunities present themselves. You know, at one point, solar was a great investment, right? Maybe not today, but at one point was,
Well, matching grants are a good example.
right, but you had to have $1 million
Yeah,
on
you
hand
gotta have
to be
money.
able to take advantage of it at the time.
Mhm.
And that's probably not the best example, but you know, there's, you know, deals with your neighboring agencies. Sometimes those come up fast and you have to be able to take advantage of it and put your, you know, just things like that come up where having, you know, a healthy reserve and, you know, I'm not saying it needs to be more than 29 million. I kind of feel like that number is pretty good number. But it allows you to do those things, right? Where it's not going to kill you if somebody comes in and goes, hey,
Mhm.
you're going to save 8 million over the next 20 years, but you got to spend 2 right now. Yeah, let's do it. This is good. I've got the 2 to do it. So there's some opportunity costs too. I'll just throw that out
Yep.
there. It really did come up, but
Well, and
Point.
for example, the city of Oceanside, not on purpose, did not charge us. So the bill has come. And it would be nice to have the reserve to pay our neighbor what
Mhm.
is owed, but we're having to spread it out. And that's not good financial wisdom.
Well, we should have been smart enough to realize they weren't building us and built the reserve at the time.
Yeah.
Sorry, I mean,
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's kind of like people in the city of San Diego who haven't had a water bill for 2 years.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But things happen and we need to be prepared. Okay.
Can I ask some questions from the last workshop?
Yes.
Because I mean, the capital really is driving a lot of this and I'm very supportive of all the capital projects, Chad. I'm just so concerned about the debt that we already have. The debt, the 2 debts that are going to be issued this year. And then issuing debt within the 5-year capital time period. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to pass on issuing debt in that 5-year period and develop a plan where there's no debt issued so we can at least get caught up and back on track. Because it is debt on top of debt on top of debt it's just very concerning for me.
Yeah, and again, I mean, that was our, that was kind of our first shot at a 10-year plan. And we dropped it into year 4, and that was intentional because some of our debt does drop off in 28. So you do have, what is that, the Morrow, or no,
Design.
the meters, the Zion
Yeah.
debt drops off. Obviously as each year goes by and we see how we progress, and if it hasn't progressed as well as we had, or Met does something crazy and we go, hey, we've got to eat some of, whatever happens.
Yeah.
I think year to year, we would reevaluate. It's exactly when are we ready to do the projects? I think we would be, but I hear you. I think that would be a year to year evaluation. And if we needed to push, we would push.
Mhm.
If we're
Yeah,
not,
I've got a question kind of chiming in on what we just asked. And that's in looking at the CIP projects that are integral to the expenses that we're, looking at trying to cover through this planning. Do you feel that you did everything you could to spread them out, break them out in a fashion so that they weren't all being, completed or delivered in a short period of time, but where it was possible to stretch them out, understanding that there's always that cost because you stretch that out, those projects out, but
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's my question,
yeah, no, and
Take that into account.
yeah, it's a good one. And really, we years 1 and 2 are very light on the projects. They're really just the absolute requirements. Again, I think as we go forward, each year we look at that CIP and pull things up that become higher priorities and move things back that
Yeah.
maybe we can defer. We took our best shot at it. I'll say that. It's probably not perfect. We will probably not follow that 10-year plan by project. By the time you get to year 3, it'll probably look a little different. But yeah.
Yeah.
So you can count pretty good on the first 2 years, but then after that it gets a little less. But I'll just say that we did our best. We always do our best to try to spread those costs out, even how we think they're going to proceed, right? We usually break out, hey, here's the non-construction component
Mhm.
followed by the construction component. So we know designs take a year or more. But again, it's kind of a best guess. We did spend a lot of time, and Chad and his team spent a lot of time really trying to refine it. So it is our best guess at this point, but it's likely it's going to change by year 3, I would think.
I guess it just goes, it's like Flint's point, can you take some of that money that was intended for reserves and put it to work and then avoid some of that debt over that 5-year time period? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if we're making progress on the
Yes.
service, I think we can make that decision.
Decision, yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
And we've been doing that over the last 8 years too. that Deferring capital improvement projects because the reserves aren't there,
Yeah.
and not wanting to increase that.
Mhm.
So,
At some point, if we don't give Robert some new pipe in the ground,
Piping, yeah,
he's gonna have a much bigger staff than he's got now.
Yeah.
Just trying to keep
Oh, I
it
know.
operating. That's what we've had to defer.
Yeah.
This pipeline replacement.
Well, I'm not saying capital is not important. That is the heart of what a district is. It's just managing through
How you
this
fund-
time when we're trying to build
Yeah.
reserves.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We're doing a lot of things. We're issuing debt. And so just being very cautious about it, I think, till we get back on track.
We also had a substantial period of time, you'll remember. Substantial period of time where we were appropriating money for capital improvement projects and nothing was getting done,
Oh, God, yes.
yeah,
remember?
yeah.
And so there's a guy over there in the green shirt, another guy with glasses back in the back. We have to thank for the fact that now, when we put money on the table, it gets spent.
Spent, yeah.
But we had a long period of time where, and I can't remember what we would do with those dollars, those capital dollars that we did not spend. I guess we rolled them over, or I don't know, but
Yeah.
that's part of what our history is too.
Mm-hmm.
Just didn't get the work done.
Yeah.
That reminds me of the story. You'll know this. Tom and I and Flint were walking the yard. And Flint looks down and talking to Tom like, isn't that like 8 or 9 pump stations just lined up? Why aren't they going to the ground? Tom was, I know. And it's just, yeah.
That's all we have.
Thank you.
Great. Information items, any comments or questions regarding the financial reports and things? Then we're adjourned till the regular board.
Thank
Ate
you.
dinner.
all
Really good.
volunteers.
Really
Thank you for being here.
Here.
Enjoy
Yeah.
it. Thank you. Bill, thank you very much. Robert, Pete, thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, that was a great report. Thanks a lot for providing it.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Nick.
Nick.
Bye, Albert.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.
Take care.
And Flint.